your single support face, okay, where only the brown leg is